As the saying goes, you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but as far as publishing is concerned, that couldn't be further from the truth. Evidently, we all actually do judge books by their covers, and no one knew this more than Marvel Comics in their heyday. I was recently going through this issue of Rough Stuff. I have a bunch of these magazines. I've mentioned them on this channel here before. There's also another magazine by the same publisher called Draw. This is part of an old collection of mine. This particular issue is from 2008. This is number 7, if anyone is interested in trying to find a used copy. But I like to dig through these magazines sometimes because there's some really great articles in here, and I feel like there's stuff in here that I haven't come across online. One of the things in this particular issue that I came across recently that I found really, really interesting was an article here on Marie Severin. Marie Severin is a comic artist from, I want to say, the 50s, 60s, and onward. She's probably best known for her work at both Marvel Comics and EC Comics. For a while there, she was a staff artist for Marvel Comics. And the crazy thing that I learned in this issue is that there was a period of time there in the late 60s to the early 70s where she was actually responsible for like 90% of the covers that Marvel was putting out at the time. Now, she wasn't drawing every cover. She wasn't making the finished art for every cover, but she was sort of like the mastermind visually behind every cover. She was designing in layout and thumbnail form a very large amount of the covers that were going out and then handing them off to whatever artist was going to create the final art for that comic, whether it was John Buscema, Gene Colan, Jack Kirby, whomever it might have been at the time. Prior to recently coming across this article, I really thought that the artist who had done the finished artwork for that particular cover, I thought it was their idea. But it turns out most of them were sketched out prior by Marie Severin. This was during that era where, this is the late 60s, early 70s, Marvel Comics has already sort of asserted themselves as a powerhouse in comics. Most of the characters that we know today were already created at this point. And Stan Lee just wanted a little bit more visual control over what was going out. He understood the importance of a cover. He knew that readers actually do judge a book by its cover. And over the course of decades of doing this, he understood what sold and what didn't. And if he just merely left it up to every artist who was working on their particular book to come up with a really cool idea for the cover, he thought, at least from a business perspective, maybe some of those covers, although might have been creatively really well done, they might not have hit certain marks in terms of marketing and selling to a particular audience. So as editor-in-chief, he just kind of wanted to like streamline that process and get a better visual idea of what was going out every month on those covers. And so doing this way, in the office, they were able to put up all these sketches on the wall and see if there were any ideas that were like repeating themselves or featuring the same character too many times, or if some of the covers were running the risk of being just too stiff and boring. This way, they were able to kind of get like a macro perspective, zoom out and see all of their titles for the month and how all of those would look on the shelf when they were at either a comic store or, more likely during this era, actually this would have been like the newsstand. So in one sense, this does kind of take the allure of the creativity out of it, thinking that every artist thought these covers up for themselves. But in the other sense, I could see where it makes sense from a business perspective, a publishing perspective. Stan at the time had a whole empire, a big company to run. And this thing wouldn't have gone on if those covers weren't just right and speaking to his audience in the correct way. So Marie Severin would draw these sketches on the back of Marvel Comics office paper. She'd make little notes in the margins right on the back and then mail them out to whoever was working on that particular comic. They would get the idea and just start working on the final image. You could see in some of these examples where some artists were very, very loyal to her sketch, and other artists took the basic idea and overall composition, but then tweaked certain elements here and there, certain poses of characters, maybe tilted an angle. just kind of took the basic idea and ran with it. They were never, it seemed, intended to be mimicked or copied exactly. It was just to sort of give a broad idea of who was going to be on the cover, what was going to be happening, and once again, just to make sure that they weren't repeating themselves or falling into a trap of just trying to like rush these things out. For instance, if a artist was really behind on a deadline or overwhelmed with work, perhaps thinking of a cover might have been like an afterthought, and they might not have given it 100% of their creativity. Whereas Marie Severin, at this time, it seems a big part of her focus in her job was to design these covers and sort of like think these ideas up. From a technical perspective, these are actually really cool to look at because drawing-wise, they're beautifully done. Great gestures, there's a lot of energy and movement. They're sort of like dashed off, but communicates an idea, but also makes it sort of clear and exciting for whatever artist is then going to take it to final. That's not an easy thing to do, and I think she did it really, really well. It's cool also to see that some of the notes that she might have left in the margins for specific details for certain artists, or even just summarizing the idea in words, just in case certain elements aren't clear. The interesting thing about the process too is that so much of this stuff in modern day is just done through email. So as an artist myself, oftentimes if I'm coming up with an idea for an illustration and I'm working with someone like an art director or an editor, I'll do this very thing. I'll send 3, 4, 5 different ideas in this kind of like rough, loose form. And then through email, we'll kind of go back and forth, discuss what idea is working best. And they might even recommend making little tweaks and changes here and there. And for the most part, it's a very seamless, easy process. But in this particular era, this is the late 60s, early 70s, there was no email, obviously. So for Stan Lee at the time to have to do this one by one with every specific artist who was working on a different comic, to go back and forth via snail mail or even in person to kind of review multiple ideas, deal with all different artists and their particular visions, it would have just been overwhelming, and at the very least probably would have just taken too long. You got to remember at this time they were churning out so many books a month. So efficiency and speed was really the name of the game. And working with what they had at the time, this seemed to really be the best solution. The interesting thing is, in the article, Marie Severin mentions that at a certain point in the early 70s, this process sort of became obsolete just because the company just kept getting bigger and bigger. There were so many more artists working on these comics, and each artist was developing their own fan base and sort of personality. And so it became more advantageous to let those particular artists think of the ideas. Anyway, I just thought that this was a really interesting tidbit as far as comic history is concerned, because this is something that I had no idea happened. I didn't know that there was this one particular artist who was responsible for so many of these covers. I think it was John Romita Sr. who was art director over at Marvel Comics, and perhaps it was during this era. I had heard that he had done a lot of this as far as ideas for covers and even doing corrections over other artists on their covers just to make sure a certain face was recognizable, or if a pose was a little bit off, he would correct things like that. She did mention in this article that the only artist, or one of the only artists that she didn't do cover ideas for, was John Romita. And perhaps that also speaks to the fact that maybe during this time he was art director as well. So, did you know about this? Was it only me that had no idea that this was going on back then? Let me know in the comments below. Also, Marie Severin is a name and a staple of comics that I had been familiar with, but I've never really taken like a deep dive into her work. And recently I came across a couple of interviews with her where she talked about the olden days working in the Marvel and EC offices, and just her experience in working in comics at that time. I'm sort of fascinated with a certain era of comics and the production behind it. And in these interviews, she gave like some really interesting insight into that time. So I found it to be really interesting. And I also learned a lot more about her contribution to comics and some of her process. So I'll try and remember to link below in the description some of those interviews. There's some good ones if you're interested. But if you know of any other Marie Severin comic work that I should check out, also please do let me know that in the comments below. So anyway, that's all I got for this video. I hope you found this interesting and useful. Thanks so much for watching. As always, I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.